Hello you gorgeous people out there, and welcome back to another video on the Rocket Tub. My name is Philip, and today you will get the long-awaited episode 2 of Spaceflight DeepDives. Welcome to Spaceflight DeepDives, my original series, in which I will pick an interesting topic out of the world of spaceflight and tell you everything you have to know about it. Videos out of this series are way more complex and longer than the normal episodes on this channel, and therefore will be released once per month. This is Spaceflight DeepDives. In this video, I'm going to talk a lot about aerodynamic surfaces, which is the topic of this video. And because it is really a lot of stuff, I divided the video in different sections or chapters with different topics. And I will put the timestamps where these chapters begin up right now, so that you can find the section that interests you most more easily if you don't have the time to watch the whole video, which I would recommend. But if you don't want to, or you simply just can't, then you can jump to the timestamps to find what you're looking for. With that said, have fun! Most traditional rockets look very similar. They are cylindrical, long but thin, and sometimes have additional booster stages on their sides. The fairing for the payload is always at the very top of the vehicle and often has a bigger diameter than the main body. Those are the main characteristics of rockets that lead our brain towards knowing that what we're looking at is actually a rocket. But then there's this new trend with partially or fully reusable systems. They typically don't look like traditional rockets at all, or at least a lot different. Most of them actually share a lot of characteristics of an aircraft, therefore they are often referred to as spaceplanes. But why is nearly every reusable launch system so different from traditional rockets that even children at low ages can say that it doesn't look the same? Like behind everything, there's of course a reason behind the more complex design of reusable vehicles and why it differs a lot from non-reusable system designs. And that reason are the flight profiles of different rockets. A non-reusable vehicle or expandable vehicle is cylindrical, thin and pointy at the top. Its design is typically as light and uncomplex as possible. Expandable rockets are optimized for descent through Earth's atmosphere, and therefore they are as pointy as they are for aerodynamic reasons. Because, well, if you have a pointed tip, the wind just doesn't matter. You have a low surface area, so you create less braking drag. And nowadays the manufacturers also pay attention to keeping their product as cheap as possible. And guess what the best design is to combine both factors? Correct, a cylindrical rocket with a pointed tip and a small diameter. On the other hand, reusable systems have a problem expandable rockets don't have. They are not just going up, but instead they're coming down again. And the aerodynamics for going down were totally different than those for going up. Therefore, the design of reusable rockets can't be optimized for ascent, but has to find the best compromise between best designs for ascent and descent. The biggest challenge engineers have to tackle while designing a reusable launch system is finding a way to control the vehicle during the violent descent through Earth's atmosphere. A reusable launch system can't land anywhere on Earth, but instead has to hit a specific place on Earth, like a concrete pad, boat, or like a runway. And although nearly every usable vehicle developed until today followed an individual approach of how they control themselves during a descent, they all have something in common. They utilize aerodynamic surfaces. At first, it might be important to know why aerodynamic surfaces are the way to go when trying to descend a reusable rocket through the atmosphere and control it during this descent. Wouldn't RCS thrusters or just the engines be better? For the engines at least, the answer is a clear no. A rocket typically runs on oxygen and some other liquid like kerosene or hydrogen, which are two of the most common fuels in rocketry, which has to be stored in the rocket tanks. Without fuel, you can't use the engines, obviously. And for every second you run your engine, you need some additional fuel that has to be stored in the tanks for the vehicle to burn. And the longer the engines run, the more fuel they need. That means your tank is going to be bigger, because that extra fuel has to be stored somewhere, which has a negative impact on the amount of cargo the rocket can lift. And that means that if you choose to control your vehicle's descent with the engines, you need a huge amount of extra fuel that has to be carried around all the time. And that extra fuel weighs so much that it makes your payload capacity going down by a lot, because you need that amount of weight for fuel. Unless you make the rocket bigger. But then it needs more engines, which require again more fuel, and the rocket has to grow again, so it needs more engines. Well, I think you see where this is going. The other option would be RCS thrusters, or reaction control systems. That's what the abbreviation stands for. They're typically powered by compressed cold gases like nitrogen, which is basically compressed air. Those thrusters are actually used on most of the world's reusable vehicles, but only in space. In the atmosphere, they could technically be used to rotate your vehicle, but due to air resistance, the vehicle would be pushed back into its original orientation, defined by the positions of the center of mass and the center of drag. To correct this effect, the RCS thrusters would have to fire all the time, meaning you would require a really big COPVs to store all the compressed nitrogen to power them. And those COPVs would make the rocket heavier again, and now you are in the same situation as if you used the engine of your rocket, meaning RCS thrusters are very inefficient to control a vehicle in the atmosphere during descent. Aerodynamic surfaces are able to fix exactly this problem, because they are moved by hydraulic systems or electric motors which just need a bit of electricity to work, which can be stored in small battery pack, having nearly no impact on the vehicle's dry mass and total weight, because the battery pack isn't that heavy at all compared to the whole rocket, which typically weighs a few hundred to 1,000 tons. Additionally, they can stay in the same position for longer time and can prevent the vehicle from flipping back into its original position. Aerosurfaces are practically the only viable solution for this problem. Now that we know why engineers utilize aerodynamic surfaces at all, it could be nice to know how they actually work. That question isn't even that easy to answer as it may seem, because aerosurfaces on the vehicle that already exist, they couldn't be more different than they are. Every single one of those follows a completely different approach to the same problem, and therefore they work in different ways, but all of them are based on the same physical principles. During the descent of the vehicle through the atmosphere, the aerodynamic surfaces are moved into the airflow around the vehicle, which is created by the vehicle falling down to Earth and the air passing by its hull, allowing these aerodynamic surfaces to create a specific amount of drag on a specific amount of the vehicle. And more drag means that your vehicle experiences a force pushing against this specific part of the vehicle, letting it change its orientation slightly but quickly. By changing the orientation of the vehicle relative to the airflow, multiple other effects like lift or even more drag can be created, giving the vehicle full maneuverability in Earth's atmosphere. A vehicle is able to rotate around the three axes of three-dimensional space, the X, Y, and Z axis. But in the aerospace industry, you don't just call it rotate around the X-axis, for example. Instead, their different rotations have specific names called pitch, yaw, and roll. On a typical aircraft, or spaceplane in our case, pitch means that the nose is going up and down, yaw is the movement to the left or right, and roll is lowering one wingtip while rising the other. And this principle is applied to reusable rockets as well, although pitch, yaw, and roll may be defined a bit differently from vehicle to vehicle. I've already mentioned aerodynamic surfaces being applied to every single reusable launch system developed until now for multiple times, but everything I told you yet applies only for aerodynamic surfaces in general, and not for the forms on different vehicles, because knowing that it can create drag doesn't mean you understand how the rocket is moving. So, how do those types of aerodynamic surfaces work on the different vehicles developed by today? Until the present day, there have been three usable launch vehicles: the Space Shuttle, the Falcon 9 and Heavy, and of course, Starship. And all of those utilize some form of aerodynamic surfaces that we can compare. But there have also been a few non-reusable launch vehicles with aerosurfaces, including the Saturn V moon rocket. But the aerosurfaces on those vehicles aren't that type of aerodynamic surfaces we are talking about in this video, since they can't even move and are only there for stabilization of the vehicle during ascent. For purposes of this video, I recreated some simple model versions of our three vehicles with the aerosurfaces highlighted. I also colored those model aerosurfaces differently for every position change they make to clear things up. Blue is the standard position, always on all three vehicles, and red and yellow signify a different state of the aerosurface. The very first reusable launch vehicle ever developed was the Space Shuttle Orbiter. The external tank was expanded and the boosters were just refurbished, not really reused, only the shuttle itself was reusable. The shuttle is basically what we think of if we hear the term space plane. I mean, it has wings and a vertical stabilizer. It really looks and also works like a plane when in Earth's atmosphere. And just like a plane, the aerodynamic surfaces on the space shuttle are basically just rudders. The shuttle is able to pitch over its nose by extending its elevons mounted at the back of the shuttle's wings. Those elevons can extend upwards to lift the shuttle's nose and downwards to lower it, providing control over the amount of lift the shuttle's wings receive. The elevons are also used to control the roll of the shuttle, rotation around the x-axis in this case. You can achieve roll by extending the elevons on one side upwards and the elevons of the other side downwards. The drag of the airflow now pulls one wing up and pushes the other down. The shuttle rolls. But the wingward elevons can't control the yaw of the shuttle. To control this movement around the y-axis, the shuttle has a rudder on its vertical stabilizer at the back of the vehicle. This rudder just works like it does on an airplane. It moves to the side to which you want to turn and creates more drag either on the left or the right. It also can split itself to extend on both sides to function as an air brake to slow the shuttle down. Despite having actual wings and other plane-like parts, like a vertical stabilizer and rudders, the gliding capabilities of the shuttle were really limited in its aerodynamics, but closer to those of a brick than to those of a plane. After all, it had to find the perfect compromise between being an aircraft and a rocket, leading to a more massive design. Modern space planes like the Dream Chaser or the X-37, as well as the Gamma concept by Firefly Aerospace, utilize the same principles as the shuttle, but are better suited for a task since technology has advanced since the 1980s. The Buran, the Soviet space shuttle, worked exactly like the American shuttle. Obviously, I mean, it was nearly a copy of the American version. The only reusable launch vehicles operational by now are the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. These two rockets have nearly nothing in common with the space shuttle. They look pretty much like traditional rockets despite being reusable. But they are very different from an Atlas V, for example, although the differences aren't that obvious at the first glance. The Falcon 9 and Heavy are very similar to each other. Falcon Heavy is basically three Falcon 9s strapped together, but the boosters have received some slight changes due to higher loads. Both vehicles are among the class of partially reusable vehicles. Only the booster and the fairings can be recovered and reused. And despite having literally nothing in common with the space shuttle at all, except being a reusable rocket, the Falcon 9's booster has aerodynamic surfaces as well. Although the fairing recovery is really interesting, it is absolutely unimportant for this video, because they are not equipped with any kind of aerosurfaces at all. They are just recovered by falling down from sky with a parachute. But let's go back to the booster. It somehow manages to maneuver through the atmosphere and land on a predetermined spot after falling from altitude of around 100 kilometers, despite having no wings, rudders, or anything plane-like stuff. So how does the Falcon booster do that? It uses small grid fins on top of the booster near the interstage, which are made of a special titanium alloy to withstand the immense re-entry heating. Those grid fins are able to gimbal around their mounting points and can either lift their left or their right edge. This allows them to change the surface area relative to the airflow, enabling to regulate the amount of drag they create. The grid fin receives the most drag when oriented in an angle of around 45 degrees relative to their standard configuration, in which they receive nearly no drag at all, because the air can pass right through them. During launch and ascent, those grid fins are folded to the side of the booster to create no braking drag at all. To achieve full maneuverability, the Falcon booster is equipped with 4 of those grid fins, one on either side of the vehicle. And just like the Space Shuttle, the grid fins can provide pitch, yaw, and roll to the booster when descending through the atmosphere. Pitch and yaw can be achieved by orienting 2 opposite grid fins in the same direction. Now both of those grid fins experience an insane amount of drag, so the vehicle pitches over to that direction until the surface area of the grid fin is close to minimum again. Because the booster gets tilted, the airflow creates a small amount of lift under the hull of the vehicle, letting it glide into the direction the engines are pointing to. And of course, the Falcon booster can control its roll with the grid fins as well. You could have imagined. Well, just by rotating all 4 fins in the same way. Due to created drag, the booster tries to flip in all 4 directions at the same time, and because that's not possible, it rolls around its y-axis. Grid fins are not used on the Falcon 9 exclusively. Many bombs and missiles from the military use them for stabilization and control in the same way as the Falcon booster. And other rockets are going to utilize the principle as well, like SpaceX's upcoming Super Heavy and probably Rocket Lab's Neutron rocket as well. And the third and last type of Aerosurfaces we are going to look at is pretty new and used on our favorite future rocket ship, the SpaceX Starship. The way Starship descends through the atmosphere has never been tried out before and follows a completely unique approach. The aerodynamic surfaces used on Starship are pretty dominant in its design. Starship has a total of 4 extendable and retractable flaps, organized in 2 pairs of mirrored flaps, 1 pair of forward flaps and nose cone at the top of the vehicle, and 2 aft flaps at the bottom near the engine skirt. The profile of descent through Earth's atmosphere that Starship follows is very unique. Instead of taking an approach close to the ones of the Space Shuttle or the Falcon booster, Starship performs a maneuver called the belly flop. It orientates itself belly first and falls through the atmosphere like a skydiver, before reigniting its main engines, flipping back into the vertical, and performing a propulsive landing. The flaps on starships are basically air brakes, used to slow the vehicle down when entering the atmosphere with orbital velocity, which is achieved by creating additional drag with fully extended flaps. To control the vehicle, SpaceX changes the amount of drag and therefore the amount of velocity loss at different parts of the vehicle. Fully extended flaps create a huge amount of drag that creates a forced fighting against gravity, slowing the fall of Starship down. If those flaps are in a retracted position, this force gets weaker, and due to lack of drag, and the amount of speed Starship losses gets smaller. By creating such differences in the deceleration of the vehicle, pitch, yaw, and roll can be controlled. On Starship, the definition of pitch, yaw, and roll is the same as on aircraft. Raising and lowering the vehicle's nose is called pitch, movement to the left and right is defined as yaw, and rotating around its own axis is what we call roll. Pitch can be controlled by bringing the 2 pairs of flaps into different positions. When falling perfectly horizontal, the forward flaps are fully extended and the aft flaps are nearly fully extended, but a bit less than the forward ones. That's due to the fact that the surface area of the aft flaps is slightly bigger than the surface of the front flap, meaning they would create more drag than the forward flaps if all 4 flaps were fully extended. To lift Starship's nose, the forward flaps stay fully extended and the aft flaps retract, so that the nose experiences way more drag than the aft flaps, breaking the aft section of the vehicle less down than the tip, resulting in the nose being lifted. This also works the other way around. By extending the aft flaps and retracting the forward flaps, the nose gets lowered. This mechanism has already worked out and is clearly visible during the test flight of Starship serial number 9. Shortly after entering the belly flop phase, as the 9 overshoots the intended horizontal orientation, its nose is pointing way too low. Therefore, it extends its forward flaps to the maximum and retracts the aft flaps, letting it cancel out the wrong orientation by lifting its nose. After SN9 reached the intended orientation, the aft flaps are extended again to stabilize the Starship. The second type of movement, yaw, meaning the movement to the left or right, is provided by the flaperons as well. To yaw to one of those directions, Starship retracts just one of its 4 flaps. Due to the missing drag created by the flap retraction, the Starship is pulled over by the airflow. How does that work? Well, if you for example retract the left aft flap of Starship vehicle, the right side experiences more drag than the left. Therefore, the nose of the vehicle gets pushed over to the left, meaning you have achieved the yaw to the left. That, of course, also works the other way around. The aerodynamic surfaces on Starship can control the third movement roll as well, but they will probably almost never do so. Roll on the Starship vehicle means rotation around its own axis, and that is something you don't want to have while letting Starship descend through the atmosphere, because that would make your Aerosurfaces useless. Why? Well, aerodynamic surfaces work with the drag the airflow creates on their surface. If you were to try to let a Starship roll during descent, you would turn its flaps out of the airflow so they can't create drag anymore. And if there's no drag, there is no maneuverability. But you could technically try to let Starship roll by extending both flaps on one side of the vehicle and retract both on the other side. That would make Starship roll a bit, but you would lose control over the vehicle very fast unless you roll for just a few degrees. Now that we know how the different vehicles control their pitch, yaw, and roll, I will put up all 3 vehicles side by side so you can take another look at them in Corbin on your own. I will shut up during this time so you can concentrate on the animations. Aerodynamic surfaces are practically the only way to get reusable vehicle back to Earth. And therefore we will see a lot of vehicles featuring the weirdest designs of aerosurfaces in the future. But despite being so different, they all utilize the same physical principles to create the ability to move around in the atmosphere. Let them be grid fins, flaps, elevons, and side rudder or little wings, which Blue Origin's new land rocket will feature. They all are based on the distribution and regulation of drag. Drag created by the airflow around the vehicle falling down from space to Earth. And whatever design future engineers will come up with for the aerodynamic surfaces on their vehicles, they all will take advantage of the same principles as the ones already existing. We are in fact in the beginning of a new era in spaceflight. The era of usable spacecraft has just begun, but in a few decades there won't be any expandable rockets left in operation at all. Partially and fully reusable vehicles like Starship will dominate the growing launch market, and every single one of them will feature certain types of aerodynamic surfaces. We have taken a closer look at some of them, and if you have paid a little bit of attention to what I showed in this video and what I was saying, you now know how all of those future vehicles will control themselves in the atmosphere. For those of you dreaming of a future in the aerospace industry, that could in fact turn out to be useful. And I think it's an interesting thing to know for everybody else anyway. That's it for the second episode of Spaceflight DeepDives on my channel. I worked on this video for almost a month and spent a lot of mental energy to finish it and show you the results. And because of all the work that I have done, I'd really appreciate it if you decide to like this video, share it with your friends, and hit the subscribe button. It would really help me an awful lot. We see ourselves next week with another regular episode, and until then, I'm out. Cheers.